Hi, so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today's session on procuring retrofit projects with Baily Garner. My name's Alex Kramer-Smith and I'm a consultant at Turner & Townsend, and we're joined today by Adam Pannell and Stuart Wigley from Baily Garner. This is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, delivered by Turner & Townsend. Thanks everyone for joining, and I'll now hand over to John Milner. I'll now pass over to Stuart Wigley and Adam Pannell to start today's session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much for the introduction, Alex, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending and joining us today. As Alex has said, my name is Stuart Wigley, and I'm joined by Adam, and between us, we'll be taking you on the journey of procuring retrofit projects. We'll be leaving plenty of time, as Alex has indicated at the end, for questions and answers, so as and when or if you've got any queries that you'd like to raise or any questions, please do make a note of them and we can run through them at the end of the session. In terms of the agenda for today, this sets out the content of what we'd like to run through with you, starting with setting the scene and the purpose and intended outcomes of today's session. Adam will firstly take the section reviewing the current challenges within the construction sector and what we're seeing at the moment and seeing in the market. And he'll continue with discussing the typical procurement routes used when delivering retrofit projects. I'll pick up and start to review the information and data required when thinking about delivering your retrofit projects. And we will touch on what will happen, or if what happens when you need to make a change and the consequence of making change, before finishing off and then finishing with several top tips and then leading on to questions and answers. So, purpose and outcome from today. The purpose of today's session is to develop an understanding of what procuring retrofit projects in the current market entails. So we'll be thinking about and looking at the challenges, the pitfalls, the practicalities of procuring projects in the current environment, how to get the best out of that market engagement that you undertake, and your interaction with the supply chain. What does that look like and what does that mean? And understand the significant role that data plays in this interaction with the supply chain. We'll share some feedback on common routes to procure projects and use lessons learned from to help inform some practical top tips. So in terms of outcomes, our aim is that at the end of this session, you to be able to feel confident with knowledge on the current market challenges and what the pressures that are being faced within the construction sector, and just acknowledging that it is just a snapshot in terms of what we're seeing at the moment, and undoubtedly it will change over time. And together with this knowledge of the different procurement routes and approaches, you should be well placed to develop strategies in terms of delivering effective solutions that are that deliver against your brief, engage effectively with your stakeholders and supply chain, and have successful projects that are well resourced and correctly priced. Now, in order to get us underway with the first topic, Adam's going to talk about the current market challenges.
Thank you, Stuart. So I won't go into too much detail in terms of the widely known market challenges that we've all faced over the last 4 or 5 years, COVID, wars, etc., to name a few. In terms of the current market challenges, especially for the kind of retrofit environment, is a lot of the focus on the levels of activities here in sectors. So as we are probably all aware of, the shift kind of from new build construction and new opportunities like that kind of shifts towards existing stock. And so a lot of clients are starting to focus on improvement of the existing stock over new sites, which is great, obviously, in terms of retrofit, but that does then kind of flood the market with everyone looking to get on board in terms of retrofit projects. So appetite for tenders, we have seen a massive increase in appetite for tenders for retrofit projects. You may be aware that recent wave 3 of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund was oversubscribed. I think the figure in my head was over £1 billion oversubscribed for that fund. So that just kind of demonstrates the appetite for retrofit projects, appetite for kind of tenders. In terms of risk, as I briefly mentioned there, with some of the market conditions that we've faced over a number of years, insolvencies are kind of at records high at the moment. And there was even an announcement, I think, of another large maintenance firm that has just appointed administrators today. So it's still quite an ongoing risk that the market is facing, and some big names, obviously, which has impacts on a lot of smaller organisations as well. And what we're then seeing because of this risk is a lot of clients are looking to kind of firm up contract terms and clauses and to kind of mitigate risks, performance bonds, that kind of stuff, to try and obviously protect themselves if that does come to fruition. In terms of capacity, as I briefly mentioned, because of that appetite for tenders and the increased kind of flooding of the market, we often see capacity-wise that a lot of contractors are not as hungry, shall we say, for certain opportunities. So because the capacity is there, because the number of projects are there, you might find that you're not getting as competitive tenders for certain projects because there's a lot of choices, a lot of options, which, on one hand is great. There is all these numerous activities going on. On the other hand, in terms of cost-wise, it also does tend to drive up the cost. Skills, knowledge and competence. Competence is something that we have all been a lot more focused on with the Building Safety Act, especially bringing in certain requirements for competency. And with retrofit, competency is probably a kind of specialist area where there is an even higher kind of lack of skills, knowledge and competence. We did have a number of years ago, a big drive for past 2035, but that role has, it's seen some pushback because some people feel it's complex and can increase cost. Whereas we believe, that standard is kind of codifying good practice and helps avoid past mistakes. So what I'm saying is, in terms of competency, there is that kind of lack of skills and knowledge, and also a kind of shift potentially away from having to have that expertise. But it is, especially with retrofit, it's a vital kind of cog in the machine there to avoid kind of past mistakes and have a successful project. So hopefully we are going to see more and more people coming through, gaining that knowledge and gaining that competency around retrofit. Delivery at scale, in terms of delivery at scale, obviously this we are going to touch on it, I think, later on in the data and on the existing stock that you have. There are challenges when clients have a number of properties, hundreds, if not thousands of properties that need retrofit. And there are different options. And I won't get into too much detail at this section because we've got a procurement section later on. There are different options on how you procure that and the best routes to take to deliver retrofit at scale. And again, looking ahead in terms of current market conditions, I won't go into too much just because we are going to touch on it more. But knowing your stock, knowing your data, obviously on that existing stock is one of the most important aspects to avoid a lot of the kind of risks and pitfalls that we find on these projects. The majority of problems come when you get into contract, having tendered on existing stock that you're not fully aware of what needs there are on it. As I said, we will touch on that probably in this section. So thank you. So typical procurement routes. So in terms of develop a procurement strategy, kind of set out here is the definition stage. And so what are the design standards required to be achieved? That often will kind of push you down a particular procurement route. If you've got quite a strict design standard you want to achieve, kind of design that you want to keep in-house and keep control of, then there are different procurement routes to go down, as there are if you're not as focused on what design you want. You've just got a kind of set of basic requirements, and then there's particular procurement routes to take with that one. So the key there is to obviously understand exactly what you need, what control you want over that design, develop your kind of retrofit plan. So I might mention it on another slide, but what we usually see and would suggest is to kind of overlay that retrofit plan with well-known design standards. So REBA plan of work, for example, is very useful in terms of splitting up each stage of the design development. I don't believe there's been a retrofit REBA stage of plan kind of overlay, although we have taken a punt at doing that ourselves. But that is quite an important stage, just obviously setting up that plan, each stage having them gateway approvals to help develop the design. And I did mention it, data. So what data is available and what further data do you need? This aspect is probably, in terms of retrofit, one of the most important parts to get right. If you go into something and when your data isn't as clear and precise as it could be, you are going to run into a number of problems once you're actually in contract, and it can result in delays and additional costs. So getting the data right from the off is very important. Stakeholder engagement, again, what the data aspect might be important kind of at the pre-contract and early stages. But what we find is once you're actually in contract on site, access to properties is one of the kind of key risks to manage. It can have particular impact on smaller kind of scale schemes. If you've got kind of a 10-unit scheme and you can't get access on the data, 4 or 5 of them, and that's going to have, a massive knock-on effect to program and potentially cost. So keeping that engagement and liaising with residents, obviously, throughout the whole process is vitally important. Tied into that is setting them realistic timescales and milestones, understanding how long, we touch on it later on, but understand how long design stages can take. Different procurement routes will have different lengths of design stages and design development. And so if a key driver is program, then there are particularly different procurement routes to take that have benefits to that. And scale, in terms of properties, we mentioned their use of type. So we mentioned it in a later section, but if you are retrofitting kind of at scale, what we found is using kind of a JCT measure term contract with archetypes is an easier way to manage that process. If you are going to retrofit at scale, we're talking kind of hundreds and thousands of properties, having to do kind of a retrofit design per property, you can imagine how long that could take. So kind of creating these archetypes for a particular type of building and what requirements, obviously retrofit requirements, designs, changes are needed on them archetypes is a much more effective way of delivering it at scale. It's also useful in terms of cost advice to have that archetype, because then if you've obviously got an appointed QS, they can produce a cost plan, which is going to estimate kind of what cost expenditure you're going to have, which, if you are retrofitting hundreds and thousands of properties, it'll be good to know how much that's going to cost before you get into that. Thank you. Yep. In terms of developing then that procurement strategy, so I've literally just touched upon it. Budget, having a cost plan set out in terms of retrofit measures, how much kind of the capital cost is, and also useful information if you want to know whole life costing, the cost of that measure throughout the building's lifespan. But setting the budget is key if you are especially retrofitting at scale, because that can have a massive impact. What we have been able to set out before in the past is if there's certain, say you've got kind of 6-7 measures that you are doing to a particular unit, if you've got the cost advice on the capital cost of that, and you also know kind of what benefit that particular measure is having to the performance of the building, then you can always make decisions on, right, okay, well, these measures are kind of costing less and actually have a bigger impact in the performance, in improvement of the performance of the building, than a particular measure that might not be improving it as much and have a higher capital cost. So that information is always very useful to have in terms of managing budgets, viability of projects, etc. In terms of monitoring lessons learned, I think we touched upon that in terms it's about procuring the right team effectively. What you do need, if you don't have that in-house experience, appointing an expert on retrofit is a key in mitigating kind of risks, and hopefully obviously have their own lessons learned from their experience at retrofit projects. And what we have found is it's not often enough. If you've got a project manager, for example, that's experienced in new builds or maybe refurbishment projects even, because retrofit does have its own unique challenges, its own language, its own kind of design intent, etc. So having that expert appointed to lead on that process is always going to be, a great benefit. And touching on it earlier in terms of the past 2035 accreditations and qualifications, individuals like that with that expertise are always going to be a big benefit on avoiding kind of common pitfalls of retrofit projects. Thank you. Yep. In terms of procurement strategy for design, this then falls into, and I've touched on risk as well, what procurement strategy you want to adopt. So there are benefits, obviously, to, both single stage and 2-stage tendering, for example. There's also benefits of traditional procurement and design and build procurement routes. Each of them will have their own kind of aspects in terms of how you develop that design. The traditional route, if you are going to go down that route, then obviously that's where the client maintains the control of that design. They also then maintain the risk of that design if there are any issues. And with retrofit and kind of refurbishment in general, it is often that there are quite a lot of changes once you get on site because you've not been able to kind of survey and you don't know your data isn't there on your existing stock. And we touched on that earlier in terms of the importance of that data being correct. That is really going to kind of drive how you procure that design, which route you take, how you develop that design. If you've got the data there, then it's going to be useful, and you're more likely obviously going to kind of keep control of that design and develop that down a traditional route. If the design isn't there, the level of data isn't there, then it might be more beneficial to go down that kind of two-stage tendering route, maybe even design and build route, where you get a contractor on board to help you develop that design. They're able to go and do surveys, etc., and get a better idea of what the existing stock's like. In always continued engagement wise, keeping the residents obviously updated with the progress will help in terms of access. I mentioned earlier that it always is the biggest issue and risk that we have to manage is access to properties, and it can obviously cause big delays. So I'd say I might have touched upon most of this already. But in terms of traditional then, so as mentioned before, with this one, the risk does sit with the client still. In terms of specification and drawing, it's usually a lengthy process. In terms of the early stages, you've got a lot longer kind of developing that design before you then get someone on site and able to kind of have a look at more in depth in these buildings. And so the specification drawing, you'd be appointing a designer that's got a competence for retrofit projects to develop that design, using that, and then the risk of that stays with them during the construction as well. If there's any changes, etc., then that design team is still appointed by the client and they'll provide them updates to the design. Design and build, for example, then is kind of the opposite of traditional in terms of you pass that risk onto the contractors to take that design liability. And so again, useful if you are more risk adverse, and also useful, I suppose, if you want to get that buildability input from the contractors. So particularly complex projects, if you are procuring a contractor that has a lot of retrofit experience, that can be a good benefit in terms of them having a review of the design and a level of input into the design to procure and develop that design to avoid kind of common issues that are found. And mentioned earlier, in terms of the delivering at scale, especially the measured term contracts, we often find are the best route to take with that. And so that's going to be setting it up in terms of that archetype process where you've got costs kind of for a particular archetype, and you can then kind of go off that measured term contract. It can go on for a number of years, and there's particular clauses in how you manage kind of increases, etc. on that one. But that is usually the most beneficial route to take when delivering at scale. So in terms of how long does procurement take, it does depend on the route you are going to adopt. So in terms of single stage tenders, I did mention it, you've got a bit of a longer process kind of pre-contract, and then before you get into the kind of on-site actual construction works. Whereas if you're going to go down the two-stage tendering, there is a shorter kind of process at the beginning, but then the contractor gets on board, they have to develop the design. So the overall design period might take longer, but you then get an overlap between the design and construction period, which then potentially does save you time on the overall program. So benefits for both. In terms of if you have got the data there, then that kind of single stage traditional route might be the biggest benefit to you. Often if you don't have kind of that full level of detail in your data, then the kind of two-stage approach might be more beneficial. But in terms of how long does it take, we often find kind of from REBA stage 1 to 4 for the kind of single stage there, it can take kind of between 6 to 9 months, whereas two-stage process can potentially be a little longer than that or a little shorter than that, depending on the level of input you get from the contractor and what that kind of two-stage, second stage kind of procurement is involvement-wise. So it's probably similar kind of to single stage if you've got a kind of competent contractor on board. What do I need to do in terms of procurement? Well, I would suggest appointing a expert or a professional to help you, give you that advice on which is the most suitable procurement route to take. In terms of the early steps, as I mentioned before, getting all your information ready, getting all your data ready. The more, the higher level of information you've got before you go to tender, the more accurate your tenders are going to be, the less kind of clarifications they're going to be, and the kind of shorter process in terms of developing that design afterwards. So getting all that data ready and appointing the right professional team is always the first steps to take. What level of detail is required, again, does depend on the procurement route. So I've already mentioned, if it's going down the traditional route, you're going to need a lot more higher level of detail design. You're talking up to kind of REBA stage 4 for the developed design. And whereas if you're going to go down the kind of 2-stage route, the design might not be as progressed, because you're going to get that contractor on board to help you develop that design. In terms of cost information wise, I would expect you to have had kind of a QS have a look at it, a cost plan kind of to indicate what level of cost you might likely going to find. It's always quite important to have that approach, so you know what your budget is and you know it's going to be a viable project. And what can clients do to make projects more attractive? It's probably a cop-out to say all of the above that I've just mentioned, but it is in terms of the data and that level of detail you've got when you're producing your tender documents. If that is evident, then you're going to get the contractors hungrier probably for tendering for that project. There are projects that are probably out there that don't have a level of detail, and there's a lot of kind of holes in that information that contractors might review and say, oh, this is too much of a risk for us to take on. So definitely developing that design and the level of data you have is always going to make your project more attractive to tender for. Okay, so what is the extent of input expected from clients? Probably another one that is very dependent on the procurement route you've taken. If you are going down that traditional route, then everything is led from the kind of client in terms of the development of the design. Obviously, they would have appointed that professional team to do that on their behalf. But again, you are going to have to inform that professional team of what your kind of expectations are. If you are going to go down the design and build route, again, you might not have had that design developed as much, but you do need a set of employees' requirements that are going to be quite detailed, setting out exactly what you want the contractors to design on your behalf. And how much residence will disrupt is probably very dependent on what measures you are putting in place in terms of retrofit measures. If you've got kind of external wall insulation going on, new roofs, etc., going in, then there's going to be a lot more disruption to residents than some kind of more minor, less intrusive changes to people's properties. So yeah, I suppose in terms of how much residents will be disrupted is very dependent on what you're actually going to do and put in place.
Great. Thank you very much, Adam. So Adam started off by reviewing the uncertain world that we're in terms of market conditions. We've got potential tariffs being noted today in terms of being levied from America. So in terms of this shifting sands that we're seeing, the one thing that we can be more confident about is about producing data ourselves. So in terms of engaging with the supply chain and developing coherent procurement strategies, we can be in control of the data. And so the key to procuring works is the data. So the quality of data, the structure that you've got, the reliability of the data, accuracy, and how well organized it is. So a fundamental aspect, and Adam mentioned it several times, is the data that's utilized both in terms of delivery, but also in terms of procurement. And the type of data that's required can fall into a number of categories. Ultimately uses stock condition data. So data that you should be aware of in terms of your existing stock. So it could be that it's undertaken a number of years ago. So does it need updating? How accurate is it? And does it need populating with further details in terms of reflecting the condition of your property? Energy performance certificates, EPCs, also a useful source of data in terms of feeding through into those property characteristics that you need to be aware of, such as age, the construction, the type, obviously covering key components in terms of windows, doors, structure, fabric, as well as insulation. Combined with that is the context within which the property sits, what kind of property it is in terms of whether it's a house, a flat, a maisonette, but also are some of the measures that you're likely to implement require planning? Is it located within a conservation area? And other factors such as information that you will have on your existing stock, such as the repairs undertaken, any planned or cyclical maintenance that's scheduled to be undertaken. And a great source of information is also your residents. So the residents that are living in your properties, if they've made representation to you, if they've made complaints, you'll be acutely aware of the issues that are impacted on their lives. So, mold and damp are particular key issues. And so developing a coherent strategy that not only delivers the retrofit program of work, but also does not make the situation worse and hopefully alleviates those mold and damp issues is a key consideration. In terms of who obtains this, most of that information that I've just described will be from client organizations that they should be able to locate and should be able to develop the data based upon that. And as I said, it will need validating for its accuracy and also to make sure that it is up to date. Whether every property needs to have that profile undertaken ultimately depends on scale. Again, Adam touched on that in his earlier presentation and slides and introduced the concept of archetypes. So looking at common themes through the stock that you might be developing and profiling out some commonalities between the stock in order to make the assessment and profiling and scoping more efficient by looking at the stock overall. Especially that is important if you're delivering at scale, when you're talking about hundreds and thousands of properties compared to more modest numbers. And what comes with that is obviously access requirements. So not only access to do the works, but also access to do the surveys, find out the condition, and to get the information that's required. So being mindful of your residents and the disruption that can cause is about having a plan and implementing that in order to get the information as efficiently as possible. With regards to costs, given the varied nature of the types of measures that could be implemented, a variety of strategies align with different procurement routes. So sometimes you will have a full schedule of rates, which is a detailed measure of the works to be undertaken that are priced individually. And sometimes with a framework approach, you might have an alternative selection in terms of a sort of basket of rates for generic costs that are then applied to the specifics and then worked through once you've developed the archetypes and the complete schedule of works, applying those basket rates across the schedule of works that you're proposed to be undertaken. The design does need to reflect the proposed strategy, and then sometimes you do need to make sure that the design, the data does talk to each other in terms of making sure that the alignment occurs, especially with satisfying any funding criteria. For example, if you're needing to assess the tons of carbon saved for every pound spent. So again, making sure that you align the outputs with the data that is collated. And as mentioned about those professionals that might get involved in terms of the design and the capacity that you might have in-house and that you might be appointing external organizations, either consultants or contractors, to undertake the design for you. Ultimately, it will be the retrofit assessor that will be collating the data and formulating a strategy in terms of designing and energy efficiency improvements that the retrofit designer will be developing as part of implementing the standards that need to be progressed. So in terms of information required for procurement, I would say that to successfully procure retrofit projects or any project to that mind, you need to know what you want and clearly describe how you would want it being delivered. So you may have that experience in-house, or you may employ consultants or contractors to help you with that, but ultimately a clear scope indicating any preference that you might have regarding particular products, components, or processes or ways of doing things is really important. That procurement process, whether it's single stage, two stage, is linked to risk transfer, speed of delivery, capacity and resourcing, not just of the organizations, but also of your own organization, and also the experience they have of delivering particular projects. Aligned with that are the documents that you'll require, not just data, but other documents, such as in-house procurement forms, framework templates, together with the contractual arrangements. So the appointment of consultants, the appointment of contractors, there'll be contractual arrangements that will need to be implemented regarding their appointment. Most contracts that we come across use some form of JCT, so they frequently are amended, especially for retrofit works. So having clear documentation that sets out the roles, responsibilities and liabilities and risk transfer is really important. Contractors, when invited to participate in those procurement exercises, will respond with their own proposals. So being mindful of any caveats, exclusions, but also it's an excellent opportunity to get further collaboration with contractors to utilise their expertise and an opportunity for potential innovation adding innovation into the process. So next we move on to managing design and change. So we've produced the design. Adam will talk us through potentially if changes is required, what that means.
Thank you, Stuart. And I will just touch on, I should have mentioned a set of contract amendments, your standard contract amendments. We are trying to recommend to a lot of our clients now that they have them recommendations and set of contract amendments for the JCT 2024 suite if you are going down the JCT route, because the JCT 2016 contracts are eventually going to be phased out of use. So, and the 2024 contract is much more in line with the latest requirements and regulations. So just touch on that. In terms of managing change then, so there are different aspects of change depending on which contract you've gone down. If we touch on the JCT, traditional contracts, they deal with changes referred to as variations, whereas if D&B design and build contracts, they treat it as a change. It's defined as a change. So you've also got other contracts, NECs, which are compensation events, etc. Apologies, I'm having an incoming call which knocked me out of my Teams there. That was interesting. In terms of who appoints the designer and what you should look for them, the clients obviously usually, I think with whatever route you're going to take, are going to appoint someone to develop that design. So if you're going down that traditional route, the client will appoint the designer, the architect. If you're going to go down the D&B route, design and build route, then the client will appoint the contractor, which will obviously have their own internal designers, or they'll subcontract out to develop that design. And so it does obviously depend on which procurement route you're going to take. So just a question pop up there. What mechanisms can be incorporated into tender processes to allow the pricing proposals for innovation? Very interesting question, John. Thank you. I will touch on that once I've gone through this, because I might even have answered that once I've gone through my options. But what are the design standards required? As with majority of the contracts, the design requirement usually sets out that a reasonably competent architect who's experienced in that area of design has obviously developed design. So one of the kind of key aspects that we're talking about is that they have got to have some level of competence in terms of that retrofit design. And I Stuart mentioned kind of the retrofit assessing, retrofit design team, and I've mentioned PAS 2035. There's lots of standards out there that would demonstrate that competence if you are developing that design. I did mention design duration earlier on, actually, but again, touch on that. You are going to experience kind of from early design stages all the way through to kind of a developed detailed design. It can take up to kind of 6 to 9 months. It's kind of the kind of reasonable period that we would suggest you're looking at, depending on kind of the scale of the project. In terms of how do you keep flexibility in design without compromising costs? Very interesting question there. Each route obviously has the capacity to make changes. Particular routes may have a larger impact in terms of change. If you've gone down the traditional route, you've maintained the control of the design. However, obviously incorporating changes once you're in contract, it can come with a hefty price tag and potentially delays. If you're going down the design and build route, you still have the capacity to make changes, to request changes to design, and that can be managed. Obviously, contractor will develop the design of that proposed change. But again, each of that procurement routes does have an impact. So if you want to try and avoid compromising on cost, the earlier the better. Obviously, the early engagement, if you can make them changes to design before you kind of into contract, would be the best route. If not, if it is a post-contract change, the earlier you make that change, the better. If you are going to make it quite late in the day, it's going to have a larger impact. Once change how is change managed once the contract's appointed? I did just touch on it in terms of each of them, whatever route you take, you obviously need to confirm that change in the form of instruction. However, how it's managed is slightly different. If it's traditional, then you're going to get your architect or your design team to develop that design change and then instruct updated drawings effectively. And then the contractors will pick up obviously any changes in terms of cost. If it's a design build route, then you're going to make that request to the contractor to say, I want to make this change. And then they will develop the design, give you an indication of what that's likely going to cost and if there's any impact on program. And in terms of capturing that, whatever route you're going to take, if it's not adjacent, if it's an NEC, for example, you always need to capture that in a form of instruction to demonstrate the acceptance of that change. In terms of consequences, other than the fact there might be an increased cost, you are going to run the risk of having a delay to program, which can also have obviously a large cost attached to that. So how do you know design will be undertaken and completed on site? It's an interesting question. In terms of how do you, well, I mean, it depending on the route again, you are either driving that change or you're asking the contractor to drive that change. Having the right people in terms of your professional team reviewing that on site is always quite important. So what I see that to mean is once you've changed that design, you need to know that it's been incorporated on site. A lot of kind of retrofit measures might be stuff that you don't physically see once it's been completed because it's been closed up, for example, if it's in installation in the wall, etc. So a lot of time if we were doing a valuation on site, for example, and you're valuing the works that are being completed, we would want to see evidence of that before it's been closed up. And most contracts do give you the capacity to request kind of works that are opened up if you have any doubts. Kind of photographic evidence as well is usually quite key in terms of what measures have been incorporated and actually completed in place. Because it can be challenging if the contractor has done it all and closed it all up and there's no evidence obviously that work has been completed. So having that right professional team, sometimes we would recommend as well clerk of works potentially appointed to kind of review the quality of the works that have been done and weekly inspections that they may do, and they obviously capture that in photographic evidence and it's kind of that golden thread of information then of what measures have been incorporated and what has gone on in terms of their measures. So they're usually good steps to take in terms of maintaining that level of information of what has been completed. In terms of how you deal with a design that has not worked and who is responsible, it does depend on the procurement route again. So if it's a traditional procurement route, you've maintained the control of that design and then effectively that design responsibility does sit with you. If it's a design and build route, then more often than not, the contractor has taken on that design responsibility and they will be kind of responsible with certain measures that do not work and have to be changed. So it will really depend again on which procurement route you've taken.
Right. Thank you very much, Adam. Just moving on to top tips, which is one of our final slides as we draw things to a close. So from lessons learned, if you've run a procurement exercise and you've secured good levels of engagement with the supply chain, and there's been good levels of competitive pricing, which has been grouped together, good quality submissions, then the aim would be to make sure we repeat this. Whereas if there was a lack of appetite for the tender and perhaps there was a wide variation in pricing, then you would review your approach. A key component of that, especially being emphasised in the Procurement Act that's just come into force, is about visibility of pipeline. So that helps those that are being engaged with the supply chain to know what's coming up, to allocate resources. And in particular, early engagement can take the form of a two-stage tender where you engage with the contractor utilising something like a pre-contract services agreement, a PCSA, in which to collaborate with the contractor, develop the design, and in terms of making sure that you are aware of the work that's being undertaken to make sure that is in accordance with the contract. So by undertaking a PCSA, getting that early engagement is definitely something where a number of our clients do benefit from that collaboration with the contractor. Have a plan, I think, in terms of having confidence and providing confidence to not just those that are involved in delivering the project, but also stakeholders and resident engagement. So in terms of making sure that you have confidence that you're able to deliver your program, your retrofit program, you do need to have a coherent strategy in terms of resident engagement, and not just to obtain the data, but also for the delivery. That could be quite disruptive if you find that during the course of delivery, you're not able to access the properties to undertake the work. As Adam explained, key challenges at the moment, and to put yourself in the best position from engagement with the supply chain, is to make sure that you've got clear, concise, unambiguous data, and that it's consistent with the design. That will put you in the best place, making sure that you've got good market engagement and good levels of activity being undertaken. The ability to be agile and managing change, which feeds into elements of innovation as well, especially through the two-stage approach, where the assessment in terms of procurement is not all about cost, it's about value and added value. So that's where you're able to pick up things such as social value, such as innovation. So not just thinking about lowest cost, but maybe reducing running cost, reducing maintenance costs and ongoing cyclical maintenance. So that particular aspect is a good way of making sure that you can capture those lessons learned, feed that back into the procurement process and get some added benefits through engaging with the supply chain. So Adam and I would be delighted to take any questions.